In the autumn of 1877, a country doctor named Elias Marsh rode out to a farmhouse on the edge of a town that no longer appears on any map of New York State. He had been called about a smell. What he found inside changed him so completely that he never practiced medicine again. Orpha Dunn was sitting calmly by the window, humming, speaking softly to her sister Adelia, and Adelia had been dead for 11 days. But that is not the part the records were erased to hide. The part they buried was what Orpha had done to her own face, and the reason they buried it has almost nothing to do with murder, and almost everything to do with a version of history you were never meant to question. So let me take you back, not just to that farmhouse, to the whole strange machinery of the year 1877. The town was called Hartsmere. If you look for it now, you will find a reservoir, a stretch of forest, and a single line in a county ledger that simply reads, resettled. Officially, Hartsmere was a farming community of maybe 400 people. But the photographs that survive tell a very different story. They show wide granite avenues built for a population 10 times that size. They show a courthouse with a domed ceiling and copper fittings that no local budget could ever have paid for. They show ornamental ironwork, arched aqueducts, and a central structure the locals simply called the Old Hall, which every surviving account agrees was already ancient when the first settlers supposedly arrived. Nobody in Hartsmere could tell you who built it. They only knew that it was there before them, and that you did not go inside after dark. And here is the question the historians skip right past. Who paid for all of it? A town of 400 farmers does not quarry granite by the ton, does not raise domes, does not lay copper pipe under its streets. The county tax records for Hartsmere show almost no revenue at all. There is no railroad baron, no mining fortune, no industrial founder anywhere in the paperwork. The wealth that built this place has no source. It is as if the buildings arrived first, fully formed, and the people were moved in afterward to live among them like caretakers who had forgotten they were only caretakers. This is where the Dunn sisters lived. Orpha was the elder by 3 years. Adelia was the beauty, the one people remembered, the one who got photographed at the county fair. Orpha kept to the house, kept the ledgers, and kept quiet. Their parents had died young, in one of the fevers that swept these old towns with a regularity that later researchers would find deeply suspicious. And so the 2 sisters were left alone in a large stone house they did not build, in a town that was far too grand for the people living in it. Here is where it gets strange. In the spring of 1877, Adelia began to change. The neighbours described it very carefully, because they were frightened. She stopped recognizing her own reflection. She would stand in front of a mirror for hours and say, quietly, that the woman looking back at her was not her. She started calling herself by other names, older names, names that matched no one in the family and no one in the town. And she kept repeating one phrase that Dr. Marsh later wrote down and underlined 3 times in his private journal. She kept saying, "They gave me the wrong face." Now, the easy explanation is illness, grief, some early form of a condition we would have a clinical word for today, and maybe that is all it was. But remember where this is happening. Remember the granite avenues built for a city that never came. Remember the old hall that predated everyone, because Adelia was not the only person in these old towns saying these exact things, and that pattern is the thread that unravels the entire official story. Adelia died in October. The cause listed was exhaustion, which in 1877 was the word they used when they did not want to write down what actually happened. Orpha did not report the death. She did not call the undertaker. Instead, for 11 days, she kept her sister in the house. And during those 11 days, working by lamplight in a house full of tools meant for leatherwork and fine sewing, Orpha did the thing that would get her name deleted from history. I'm not going to dwell on the details, because the details are not the point, and frankly the town spent a great deal of effort making sure no one ever could. When Dr. Marsh finally forced the door, he found Orpha wearing her sister's face over her own, sewn, fitted, worn like a mask made of the person she loved most in the world. And when he stumbled back in horror, Orpha looked at him calmly and said the sentence that has haunted every person who has ever read his account. She said, "Now they cannot take her from me. Now we are the same one, the way we were before they separated us. The way we were before they separated us." That single sentence is why this case matters, because Orpha Dunn was not raving, she was answering a question. And to understand the question, you have to understand what people in these towns believed had been done to them. Let me pull back and show you the bigger picture. Across the 1870s and 1880s, hundreds of these oversized, overbuilt towns quietly emptied out. The official reasons are always mundane. A rail line moved, a mill closed, a reservoir was needed. And so the grand granite town of 10,000 becomes a footnote of 400, then becomes a forest, then becomes nothing at all. The buildings that were too solid to demolish were flooded, buried, or simply repurposed into asylums, orphanages, and county poorhouses. Think about that word, repurposed. It means the buildings kept standing. Only the story of who made them was thrown away. And into those orphanages poured a strange and enormous population of children who could not say where they came from. Sit with that number for a moment, because this is where the economics stop making sense. In the decades after the Civil War, the orphan population of the American Northeast exploded far beyond anything a war or a fever could account for. The relief societies of the era admitted they could not explain it. Trains ran west packed with tens of thousands of these children, and in every single case their records began at the exact same moment, the moment they arrived. No parents, no hometowns, no history before the train, as if an entire population had been lifted out of one world and reissued into another with the past scrubbed clean. The people who lived through it had a word for what they felt was happening. They said they were being resettled. And a resettlement is not just a move. A resettlement is a replacement. New names, new records, new faces on old places. The grand halls stripped of their true history and handed to a smaller, quieter people who were told, firmly, that they had always been here, that they had built all of this themselves, and that they must never, ever ask about the world that came before. Now hold that idea next to Adelia, standing at the mirror, insisting the face looking back was not hers. Hold it next to Orpha, sewing her sister back onto herself so that they could not separate them again. Two sisters in a stone house, too old to explain, in a town too grand to justify, both convinced that identity itself was something being taken from them and quietly reassigned by someone they could not name. That is not a coincidence of madness. That is two people describing the same experience in the only language they had left. And this is exactly the moment the official record slams shut. Within a year of the discovery, Hartsmere was gone. The county ledger records the town as resettled in 1878. Dr. Marsh's medical license was quietly revoked, and his written account survives only because a relative hid it inside a family Bible for 60 years. Orpha Dunn was never tried. There is no court record. There is no asylum admission under her name anywhere in the state. There is a single line in a ledger noting the transfer of a female inmate, unnamed, to a facility that was itself demolished in 1901. She simply stops existing, which, if you have been paying attention, is the most consistent thing that happens to anyone in this entire story. So ask yourself the obvious question. Why erase a grief-stricken woman in a dying farm town? Why revoke a harmless country doctor? Why flood a whole community and file it under a single bureaucratic word? A murder does not require this. A tragedy does not require this. The only thing that requires this level of coordinated erasure is testimony. Orpha and Adelia were witnesses, and their testimony, stripped of all the horror, was actually very simple. They were saying that the past had been taken from them, and someone had given them a false one to wear in its place. This is the part the Tartaria researchers keep circling back to, and I understand why. Because Hartsmere is not the only town like this. Go looking and you will find the same fingerprints everywhere. You will find the World's Fairs of that era, cities of white marble, palaces built supposedly in a matter of months, opened for a single summer, and then, according to the record, deliberately demolished. You will find the star forts, precise geometric structures scattered across every continent, all built to the same design, all credited to people who left no explanation for why they agreed on the plan. You will find courthouses and train stations and libraries in tiny towns, structures that dwarf anything the local economy could have produced, all dated to the same narrow window, all attributed to men whose own records are strangely thin. And when you notice one, you cannot stop noticing the rest. There is one more piece of this I need you to hear, because it is the piece that turned the Dunn case from a horror story into something colder. Dr. Marsh was not the only witness. 3 counties over, in the same decade, a schoolteacher named Iris Vane wrote a series of letters to a newspaper that were never printed. In them she described her own town, another oversized granite place with a domed hall no one could account for, and she described the same sickness spreading through it. Women standing at mirrors, people forgetting the names they had used the year before, children arriving on trains and being handed to families who were told to simply raise them as their own and ask nothing. Iris Vane wrote one line that lines up almost word for word with what Adelia kept repeating. She wrote, "We are wearing a life that was cut to fit someone else. Iris Vane's town is also gone now, also resettled, also underwater. Follow the money and it gets worse, not better." When you dig into the county accounts of these vanished places, you find the same accounting trick over and over. A sudden improvement district is created. Enormous sums pass through it in a single year, always to build or to restore structures that were already standing. Then the district is dissolved, the ledger is closed, and within a decade the town it served no longer exists. The money did not build anything. The money paid to rewrite who owned what was already there. That is not a farming economy. That is an inheritance being quietly transferred and a receipt being burned. That is the real horror. The mainstream historians who have looked at the Dunn fragment call it a folk legend, a distorted memory of ordinary mental illness in an ordinary poor town. And I want to be fair to that reading, because it might be right. People do grieve monstrously. Records really are lost for boring reasons all the time. Towns really do empty out when the economy shifts and the railroad chooses somewhere else. None of that is impossible, and I am not going to pretend it is. But you still have to explain the pattern. You have to explain why the towns that vanish are always the ones with architecture that nobody can source. You have to explain the orphans with no yesterday. You have to explain why resettled appears again and again in the same decade, across the same kind of place, always following the same story of buildings too old and too fine for the people handed the keys. And you have to explain why the 2 women who said out loud that their faces had been swapped and their history erased were themselves erased so thoroughly and so fast that we almost never learned their names. Maybe Orpha Dunn was simply a broken woman doing a terrible thing in the dark, or maybe she understood something that the rest of Hartsmere was far too afraid to say, that the world they were living in had been built by someone else, that the history they were handed was a mask stitched over an older, truer face, and that the only way she could think of to hold on to what was real, what was actually hers, was to refuse to let even one more face be taken and replaced with a stranger's. She sewed her sister to herself so they could never be separated. The people who ran the reset sewed a new history onto an entire continent so that no one would ever think to ask what was underneath. One of those acts we call insane and bury in a reservoir. The other one we call the textbook, and we teach it to our children. The water sits over Hartsmere now. The old hall is somewhere down there in the dark, still standing, because they never could figure out how to bring it down. And the ledger still reads resettled, which is the tidiest word ever invented for making people forget that they were ever anyone else. Orpha Dunn wanted one thing. She wanted to be remembered as she was, beside the sister she loved, before they came and gave them the wrong faces. They erased her for wanting it. So the very least we can do is say her name out loud and ask the question she was erased for asking. Whose world are we actually living in, and what did they have to bury to make us believe it was always ours?